Arg! Happy Friday, everybody. How are y'all doing? I see Chris isn't here to appreciate my letting loose, but hopefully he'll find it on the video. Everybody hyped for Halloween? Yeah. Everybody hyped for Halloween? Any good costumes? It's going to be a little bit of a bummer, right? Because of the, COVID. But we're going to have fun over here. We're going to do the best we can. Okay. So any other? Maleficent and Hades. Okay, that's good. You're welcome. If anybody else wants to put on costumes, do it. Okay. This may be the first of several costumes during this class period. We'll see how it goes on a beautiful Friday afternoon. I've got some others. Okay, so let's talk about Rachel H. and the standards. But before we do, what are we going to, are there any things that we want to talk about IDEA that we didn't cover on Tuesday? That's what I want to start with, and then we'll turn into Rachel H. for the least restrictive environment portion of IDEA. Anything bothering anybody since Tuesday that y'all want to raise? No, that's a lot of no's. Okay, well then let's talk about this least restrictive environment. So I think I said something along the lines of least restrictive environment is something that will, that is something close to an integration mandate. And so obviously we are not in the sort of traditional desegregation integration space, but we are, I'm hoping that y'all are seeing that if you segregate out students with disabilities, that is kind of like segregating out based on any other characteristic, whether that characteristic be race or sex or English speaking ability or whatever, okay? And so it's probably a little too much to say it's just like any other, right? Some types of segregation come with different messaging than other types of segregation do. But for the most part, segregation as a sort of concept is somewhat consistent. And so the least restrictive environment is saying, like, we know school districts, you are going to be tempted to segregate out the students with disabilities. And I guess let me sort of ask you guys, why is that temptation going to be there for a school or school district to separate out a student with disabilities from the classroom? If they don't have a mandate otherwise, why is that going to be their temptation? Yeah, Heather, go for it.
Yeah, it might be tempting to do so because students who don't have disabilities might learn faster and or learn in a different way. I guess is a better way to say it. So teachers might have to give individualized attention to certain students, slowing down the whole class. So schools are more, they want to at least segregate the students with disabilities out so that they can teach regular students sort of on a more faster basis.
Right. So without any sort of, without any sort of judgment or critique of the students of the school districts, I think that this instinct is present, right? This sense that there is a desire or a thought that there is an impact that a student with disabilities might have on the classroom that will affect the quote unquote other students, right? The students who do not qualify as students with disabilities, and that it will be better for the students without disabilities to have to not share the classroom. What about from the perspective of the students with disabilities? Sarah, yeah, what do you want to add in here?
Also too, to the teachers aspect, like we have like special education teachers for a reason, that's their specialty. Whereas not all teachers that go into general public education are going to be equipped to handle the different needs that these students are going to have and present. Whereas special education teachers arguably would be better equipped because that's what they're going into and expecting to, be facing.
Great. So to the extent that students with disabilities potentially create different, create different challenges for a teacher, the idea is that you can more efficiently serve those students in a separate classroom with a specifically trained teacher that will be able to provide those services, not only more efficiently in the sense that they have all of the students in their classroom, but more effectively in the sense that they have the special training to do this. And so the temptations are there to segregate out students with disabilities. And I think over the course of this discussion, we'll start to see sort of what the reasons are for this policy presumption or preference against that, right? It's basically there's a recognition in Congress that that's going to be the temptation, and therefore we need to sort of put some weight on the scale in the other direction that says, look, all things being equal, we prefer our students to be, our students with disabilities to be in the sort of mainstreamed classroom, okay? And so we have that as a policy preference, least restrictive environment. And I guess I'll just take a sort of small step back. And I don't think that we said this explicitly, but I think that it's implicit in the cases, the IDEA cases. And it is that there is often this disconnect between what the school or school district wants and what the family or student want. The school district is always looking at it. Not that school districts don't want the best for each individual student. I believe most schools do want that. It's just their capacity or their focus is not limited to just a single student. And so they're constantly, when faced with a student with disabilities situation, they're not just thinking about what's best for that particular student. They're thinking about that plus, okay, how does that fit into our broader school circumstance? I'm responsible, if I'm the principal, for hundreds of students, not just this individual student. And so the parents or the student themselves is not really worried about that, right? Not that they don't care about what happens to other students in the school, but that's not their job. That's not their scope of responsibility. And so what they want, the family preference is often arrived at independent of what the overall school consideration ought to be. And so as we move into this discussion, I want to sort of ask, should schools and school administrators be able to consider that broader perspective, or does the law actually mandate that they don't, that it's a right for an individual student, and it really is a right that is independent of what's going on with other students, okay? So the test, right? The test that they give us in Rachel H. is one, we look at and just to make sure we're all on the same page, the question that's being asked is about placement. Okay, so whereas Rowley and Andrew F. are about services, free and appropriate public education, this case is about placement. Where should the student be placed for how much of each day? And there's a disagreement about regular classroom or separated out classroom. And the court, again, not to just, this is really should just be repeating, like you've heard me say it in several different contexts now, the court is going to have to evaluate this policy decision because there is a right to an education under IDEA for students with disabilities. The court has to step in and make a policy judgment about what's right for this individual student or any individual student that's bringing a claim. similar. So, and the question is, which is the right placement? One, academic benefits to the student with disabilities of placement of the placements, right? The two options. Two, non-academic benefits to the student with disabilities in the various placement options. Three, the impact that a placement in the mainstream classroom will have on other students, broadly stated, and I want to unpack that in a second. And four, the cost, right? The cost involved. And in the Rachel H. case, they're talking about they might lose all this funding, but more often they're talking about cost in the way that we have encountered cost previously, which is like if you remember back to our concurrence in Lau, right? One of the concurrences was like, or the concurrence that we read was like, well, for 1,000 students, okay, this makes sense. But if we had like just one student, then the cost might outweigh the benefit to that student in terms of providing services to rectify a language deficiency. So hopefully y'all are seeing that connection here. So the two I want to focus on are impact on other students and cost. And the question I want to open up to the floor here is that third one, impact on other students of the student with disabilities being placed in the mainstream classroom. Is that an appropriate criteria for the court and or the school to consider in making a placement decision under the IDEA? Okay, not should it be a consideration, but under the IDEA, is it a valid consideration? So what do y'all think about that third one?
I think it's relatively important. No, it shouldn't be like obviously it's just a factor, and it's not the end all be all, but I mean, it's not like you said earlier, the policy behind that schools have to worry about is every single student, because they don't just have one student they have to take care of. And if the student's going to cause a disruption to the other students or the teacher, then yeah, it should be considered.
Okay, so you mentioned disruption. That's one of the concerns that's raised. The other is attention hoarding. So if the teacher has to spend a lot of attention on a particular student in the classroom, then that's thought to be a negative impact potentially of a mainstream placement. And so Haley says, okay, yeah, it's just, let's be real, they have to take that into consideration because they're serving an entire school. They're not just about this particular student. Other thoughts on this? Yeah, Rachel.
I was going to say that I think it is okay under the IDEA because in the readings they talk about like one of just like the philosophical objectives is like just to see a maximum extent appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is okay to do this on a case-by-case basis. Of course, some students won't be able to, but I think for the maximum extent for some students, if they are able to be placed in the classroom, it's kind of one of the goals of the IDEA. So I think it should be allowed.
So they should be able to consider the impact on other students?
Yes.
Okay. And so I guess my question for both of you guys is, where in the IDEA does it say that students with disabilities shall have the right to be in a mainstreamed classroom to the maximum extent appropriate, or the least restrictive environment as much as appropriate, so long as it doesn't bother anybody else? Does it have that other clause, the so long as it doesn't bother anybody else?
I think it's kind of inferred in the least restrictive environment, maybe because I mean it's not, and also it's not only just the benefit or the negatives that it could have on other students. It could also be potentially bad for the student themselves because if they're not getting the attention they need, then they're not learning what they need to know. But I think it's kind of inferred from that whole clause of the least restrictive environment in itself.
So I think that the impact on the student themselves is captured in the first two, right? if there's non-educational benefit or an academic benefit or an academic detriment to the student to be in the mainstreamed classroom, or a non-academic benefit. And so this is often where topics like bullying will come up, that bullying is less likely to happen in the non-mainstreamed classroom. And so some families actually prefer the non-mainstreamed classroom for students with disabilities. But so I think that to the extent that there is an impact on the student themselves, it's captured by another factor. The factor 3 is really focusing entirely on students other than the student with disabilities. And so I guess, Haley, to sort of reiterate what you've said, and I think it's right, or it's at least defensible, maybe there's some sort of implied that we can't just completely ignore everyone else in this situation when we're making a decision about an individual student. We have to take into consideration these other things, even if it doesn't say it explicitly in the IDEA. Rachel, did you have a thought sort of in response to the idea that actually the IDEA doesn't say anything about students, the other students?
There was just a part when I was reading through when they're talking about like there's just a certain statute saying that like they should try their best up into like these services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And so I think that was like Congress looking at the IDEA and understanding that there's a chance that this isn't going to work. And so I agreed with Haley that just from the readings that like the Congress recognized that of course there's going to be times when it doesn't work.
But when it doesn't work for the student with disabilities, or when it doesn't work for, other people?
Couldn't it be both?
It could be, but I'm asking what the statute, which one is the statute concerned with? If it doesn't work for the student with disabilities, I think y'all are both right. They shouldn't be in the mainstream classroom. That's why it doesn't say you have to be in the mainstream classroom. But where is the rights of other students? Where is that in the statute?
I think I totally see what you're saying, and I
But
think
it just can't be, right?
it just can't be,
that you have to ignore every other student.
yeah, it can't. That's not a good legal argument, but it's mine.
Okay, Jake, what do you think?
I mean, I guess I was just going to kind of maybe emphasize the point that you're coming from, and I'm kind of looking back over the text of it now, and it is an interesting point that it doesn't mention anything about the other students, you know what I mean? And so, maybe it would be a good policy to take that into consideration, but as far as the court looking at this statute, they're kind of just making that up, aren't they? I mean, it's not really, that's not a consideration that the statute kind of throws out there. So, maybe it's inappropriate, maybe it's not, but yeah.
It's good policy making. I think it's good policy making, but I'm not sure that it's good statutory interpretation. Jake, what are the rights of those students to an education? Do they have a right to an education? The other students?
The non-disabled students?
Mm-hmm.
I guess not.
Not really, right? We've seen
I guess in a certain way, disabled students are afforded more rights to education than non-disabled students. Maybe
substantially more.
Yeah,
substantially more legally enforceable rights. Now, whether that means they're getting better educations or not, that's a different story. But I think from a legally enforceable rights standpoint, it's undoubtedly the case that students with disabilities are at the top of the heap of American students. And in fact, I would actually go further to say that American students with disabilities are treated better than any other students with disabilities in the world. The IDEA is truly a model for providing services to students with disabilities that isn't replicated in a lot of places. And it is a right that these students have. But it stands, of course, in really stark contrast to the lack of rights that other students have, right? That we have found time and time again that there is no fundamental right to education for American students generally. You know, there's been these statutes that pop up, but beyond that, not so much. And so this, you know, I think that we sort of made the point here that the courts, when asked, are going to become policymakers, which is in fact what they are doing here. There's no statutory basis for taking into account the impact on other students. Yet, if you're a policymaker and you don't take into account the impact on other students, as Haley and Rachel are saying, like, you have to, like, it just, you know, that's just totally irresponsible if you're a teacher and you're only thinking about some students and not considering the impact of of anything on all of the students. What about cost? Should a court say, oh, this is illegal, but it costs too much, so we're going to let it go? Is that what courts do?
I think there's a balancing, between the cost and like what the projected like growth of the student will be, like, you know, how much more growth can you get per dollar, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
is that a rights-based consideration or a policy-making based consideration?
I'd say that's a policy consideration for sure. That you know, how much do we want to spend to, you know, for diminishing returns essentially in educational progress?
Would we say that yes, you can have your free exercise of religion so long as it doesn't cost us too much? If it costs us too much, then we can suppress your free exercise of religion. Would we say that?
No, I don't believe so.
Probably not, right? Cost is very rarely going to be a sufficient justification to not enforce a right that people have. And though the IDEA is not in the Bill of Rights, the IDEA is a right granted by federal statute. And it doesn't say you provide least restrictive environment so long as it doesn't cost too much. It says you provide least restrictive environment. Yet, if you're a policymaker, I think David's right, you would think, okay, what's the bang for the buck? And here we have to account for the fact that we're not just serving this particular student, we're serving a broader constituency. Okay, so it's the same basic point as with number 3. In both instances, though, the court is opening the door up to factors that favor whom? The family that wants more mainstreaming or the school district that wants less?
Is it the district that wants less mainstreaming? Okay, cool.
Yeah, most likely that is going to be the outcome of considering number 3 and number 4. And number 1 and number 2 are really focused on the individual. Number 3 and number 4 are really focused on the goals of the school district. And so, so, you know, does this test have the effect of disadvantaging individuals with students with disabilities? That's part of the debate in this space as well. The only thing I'd like to sort of throw in to close this off is oftentimes that third one is looked on as a negative, right? That it's always the impact on other students is always going to be this attention hoarding or distraction for other students, etc. But there's actually a growing body of literature that shows the benefits on non-disabled students of having students with disabilities in classrooms with them. And so that has grown out of the presence of this factor in the test, right? So disability rights advocates said, okay, well, we can't just have number 3 be all negative. Like, there actually are real positives to students without disabilities who to have the mainstreaming as well. These are the same kinds of positives that we might articulate in other types of integration, right? Racial integration, socioeconomic integration, gender diversity, etc. And so there's been a lot of sort of push to develop in a pretty robust way the benefits that non-disabled students have when there is disability integration in classrooms. Okay. Last thoughts on this? Other questions?
I have a question as far as like costs go, and I didn't see it in there, but it's like when they're calculating costs, like do they look ever at the like there's the actual cost of like the mainstreaming and the education that they're providing, but do they ever look at like the like I don't know, like extraneous costs, like if we don't provide the
Like
student,
litigation costs?
yeah. Well, I was thinking more like if we don't provide the student, you know, the proper education and they don't become, you know, productive members of society and they end up incarcerated, like that's a whole nother set of costs that are way outside of the actual mainstreaming costs. But do those ever get factored in?
I would love to see a judge try, but no, I've never seen that. I suppose you know, in the same sense, in the same way that disability rights advocates might say there are benefits to mainstreaming. It's not just all downside for non-disabled students. I suppose a sort of ambitious disability rights lawyer could say there are costs to not mainstreaming, you know, that are borne by society later on. But the school district is never going to, you know, they're going to say that those are costs that are independent of our budget. Those are not costs of a party to this litigation. And so they're going to say that, you know, they're going to push that that's well outside the bounds of a lawsuit. That, of course, if you're a lobbyist, that of course is what you should be saying, right? Like you should be saying to, you know, you see this in the criminal justice reform all the time. The costs to society of mass incarceration are enormous, right? And that's, you know, regardless of, you know, where one fits on how much someone deserves to be put in, you know, to be incarcerated. Just forget that the costs on society are so large. That's why we should support reform. That argument is often made. And I suppose you could make a similar argument here.
Could you expand it under like least restrictive environment, like least restrictive environment now versus like least restrictive environment in the future that, again, like incarceration or mental institutions or whatever it may be, are much more restrictive. And so looking like into the future for a least restrictive environment.
I love how you're thinking. As a policymaker, absolutely. In a litigation, I just can't see a court allowing that kind of evidence to be terribly convincing. Okay. So we have covered IDEA and the sort of two main parts of it, the free and appropriate public education and sort of what standard is required, you know, and how a court is going to evaluate it. And second, the least restrictive environment, same basic topic. In both circumstances, what we have are federal statutes creating obligations on schools and school districts. And this is really the close of what has started way back with Lau of what do courts do as evaluators of policy. Okay, and we've seen like in Castaneda test, we see the standards that we found in ultimately in Andrew F, and then this kind of test here in Rachel H, that courts have to, when they are forced, because there are rights, when they are forced to develop, to evaluate policy decisions, they come up with these various tests. And so all of this is meant to get at a larger question, which we're not going to really speak on right now, but I just hope that you're seeing the connection to what would the consequences be of having a broader right to education, where every student would have the ability to bring their school to court to say, you're not delivering X to me, in the way that the Gary B plaintiffs have attempted to do in that litigation. Okay. Another thing about this IDEA is that it is a federal statute. And though we have encountered a bunch of federal statutes, I want to turn to the biggest of them all, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was revised into what you guys will probably have heard of more, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Okay, and so that is where I want to transition to now. And before we do it, or as we do it, I'm going to begin with a little bit of backtracking and review. So this is going to be a little lecture-y. So let me put on my my lecturing here. Hold on. Okay. You may recognize the ponytail. Yes, I am Thomas Jefferson. This was a historical Halloween costume of Ben's at some point in the past, but I also like to wear there. I'll bring the ponytail around. I also like to wear it when I'm teaching about federalism in the education sphere, because Thomas Jefferson was very much about an education advocate. So, if you recall from that educational structure lecture that I had you guys watch way back at the beginning of the semester, there was a comment, I mean a slide like this, and it was showing funding, right, and how most of the funding is coming from local governments and the state government, but the federal government does provide dollars. And the proportion, though, is small, right? The federal government, in most instances, is providing, huge amounts of money when it's spread all over the country. But on the whole, it is usually for each school district about 10%, right? So anywhere between 10 to 15%. The first real example of the federal government doing this came in 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it was accompanied by a few different things, but the primary reason that you might know it is through what's called Title I funding. And so the federal government provided additional resources to schools that were serving students in poverty because of research that existed then and has only strengthened since then, that the costs required to serve students in poverty effectively in a school are much higher than students in middle class or higher socioeconomic circumstances. And so, so that is the sort of first intervention. And 1965, really, it's just, here's the money, right? There are conditions put on it. And one of the conditions ends up being about desegregation and sort of it. So this is part of the statutes that intervene in the mid 60s that kind of accelerate the desegregation process that had stalled in courts. But we're not going to really talk that much about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act historically. We're going to focus in more on the iteration in the 21st century of that statute. And so if we focus on funding, we're looking at this, but if we're focusing on decision-making authority, the slides we're talking about how students decide how much homework they want to, they feel like doing, and then they'll get graded. The teachers decide how to teach and how to approach students. The principals make decisions about who teaches what and what classes might be offered in a particular school. The superintendent and the school board set broader policy within the school district, and the state has overarching regulations that the school districts and then all the way down to the teacher have to abide by. What wasn't on that slide is this bottom point, which is that, but I think I did mention it in the lecture, but I'll elaborate a little bit here. The federal government does not have any mechanism to just directly mandate policy for schools. Schools remain a state-operated function, okay? And so state law is of huge importance. State actors, even down to the teacher, are the main decision makers when it comes to setting education policy. So how does the federal government then set policy, or influence policy is probably the better way to speak of it. And so what the federal government does, and began in 1965, but it has only increased over time, at least through 2015, is they have huge sums of money. And they make these huge sums of money available to school districts or states or even individual schools through spending clause legislation. And it usually takes two different forms. Sometimes they're both there at the same time, but sometimes they're independent of one another. So the first type is money that is targeted to support specific students. So for example, the IDEA comes with money, right? So you get additional funds from the federal government to serve students with disabilities in exchange for your compliance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, with the IDEA. So they say, here's the money, but in order to get it, you have to abide by the guidelines of this statute. Similarly, students, the Title I funding, here's this money to serve students in poverty, but in order to get it, you have to abide by these non-discrimination policies, for example. So that might exist. Those are two examples. Another example might be like, we really need to figure out a way to serve students with limited English proficiency. And so we're going to make grants available to schools that are trying something innovative for training students to speak better English. Okay. The other is money that is just available and connected directly to specific policy making, right? So here, it's either supporting the students, that's number one, or two, it's pressuring, some might even say coercing states to adopt specific policies or particular policies. Okay, so that is these are the ways through the spending clause that the federal government influences local education policy. Again, they're still not providing huge amounts of money, but the amount of money is significant enough to influence policy. Okay. So that is background on federal participation in education policy. Now, I want to sort of come from a different angle. So that history is unfolding from 1965 until 2001. Along that same time period, especially beginning in the late 70s and into the 1980s, there is a growing belief that American schools are in crisis, or at least a perception that the American schools are in crisis. And in some ways culmination, but in other ways, this is sort of a major transition point, comes in 1983 with the release of a report by the Department of Education called A Nation at Risk. If you're interested, it's a fascinating story about how the report came to be and maybe what the political motivations for it were. But the basic thesis of it is that if we don't intervene, then American schools are going to sort of cause us a national security crisis, because our students are not going to be prepared to compete with, during the Cold War. And they're looking at graduation rates. They're looking at where American students are scoring relative to other countries on sort of standardized measures. And so from A Nation at Risk comes, it accelerates what's known as standards-based education reform. So the idea is that we have to be more intentional about ensuring that students know what we want them to know by the time they graduate high school. and that they in fact do graduate high school. And the old way of doing it, which is kind of like leave it up to the teachers or the principals to decide, what graduation means or what is enough to pass from grade to grade, that old method was leading us towards this risk, this nation at risk, and that better to be intentional and say, we are going to say, this is what you need to know, and work to get students to that point. So in some ways, a standards-based education reform is pushing towards, the word standardization, but also like a common goal, regardless of student situation, okay? The process through which standards-based education reform takes place from a policy standpoint is that states or schools or whatever sort of whatever level that you're dealing with, right? A school could do this themselves. What we're eventually going to see is that the whole nation has to do it. Is that one, you develop standards. That is a list of what students should know to pass from grade to grade, to graduate from high school, for example. Second, you create a curriculum that aligns to those standards so that students are being taught what it is they need to know. And then you get to the sort of more law policy-based portions of standards-based education reform. One, you have assessments. So rather than just saying, okay, we're gonna say what they need to know and align our curriculums to it, we're gonna test whether or not they know it. And then that ends up being standardized testing, although it doesn't have to be. That is the way it ends up coming to be. And then you have accountability. What happens when students aren't learning it? There is support provided often to sort of get them up, right? So that students are knowing what they should know. But often there's also consequences attached. Those consequences might be attached at the student level. You can't pass from 3rd to 4th grade if you don't score a certain score on an assessment, or you can't graduate if you don't score a certain score on an assessment. Or they might happen at the teacher level. Your pay might be determined based on how many of your students are scoring at what level. They could be at the school level, or even the school district level, or even the state level. So there can be accountability at various levels, and we're going to talk about that with No Child Left Behind. Before I go further, I know I have teachers in here, and I was wondering if you guys could, to the extent that you have experience with this, elaborate on, what this looks like from a teacher's perspective. In particular, I'm thinking about the book with the standards, right? The book that sort of lays out the detailed standards that are, defining what a student should know in a particular grade. Any of my teachers can shed some light or offer some perspective on that? Nothing. I know that teachers deal with this.
I'll go if no one else wants to take it. Essentially, like, you have because I'm a little older. So when I started teaching, we still had state standards as opposed to moving into the Common Core. And so we were looking at, the state of Michigan had its own set of standards, and every state had its own set of standards.
David, let me just stop you. When you say you had the standards, what did that mean? Like, what did that look like?
So they're listed online. So it's like, they're like very specific, like, by grade and by content area. And so it's like, in 5th grade, when you're looking at science, students should learn about they need to learn, you know, all these different facets of education, like presenting the information as well as like the content itself. I don't even remember what they are, but
They need to know about molecules.
exactly, yeah.
Or they need to know these 3 things about molecules. or
And
something.
then they're tiered too. So like there may be one standard, and then it's like broken out through different grades, where like in the first grade you're supposed to learn like there's a thing called an or an element or something like that, and then by the time you know they get to middle school, you know they need to be understanding the energy levels of a molecule or of an atom. So it's like
Right.
it's all tiered and everything is like very cohesive, I guess.
And thorough and specific.
Very, very.
Yes. Takesha, I saw your hand. I didn't know if you want to add something in or if you had a question.
No,
Okay. Rose?
so just to, I guess to add on to David's piece, and I, I don't know if people who aren't teaching were kind of quiet because we didn't want to go back and think about our maps and our standards. But what I was thinking about is so we had our standards were in our curriculum map. And so they were all in one place. They often were broken down by week and very specific goals and things that are, you know, that were the student was supposed to make by that week. Definitely tiered, often tiered. All of ours were tiered, I guess, from my experience. But they weren't general. They would start general and then they would get specific. If that makes sense. Definitely by content too, because I taught different subject matters, and so sometimes some subject matters were extremely extensive and explained, and others there was a little bit of a leeway.
Good, thank you all. Evan?
Yeah, just I guess adding standards is always like Rose is right. Hearing standards is always kind of like
Trigger.
a trigger for sure. But I pulled up Tennessee's. I taught math in 4th and 5th grade, and I pulled up Tennessee's to see if they were the same or if they'd changed much in the last 2 years. But there's kind of a grid, and math is kind of broken down like really specifically.
I've made you co-host. Can you share it?
Yeah, maybe.
Just briefly. We're not trying to teach math to 4th and 5th graders here, but
Right.
I just want y'all to have a sense of what it looks like.
Can people see that? So this is like the learning progressions of it. The part that always kind of triggered me, I felt like, was if you scroll down, like this is more like structure of standards, but this part right here is very much what it looks like. It always reminds me of statutes. Like this is grade 3 measurement and data, cluster A, standard 1, and they're all kind of laid out that way. It took me about 2 years of teaching before I figured out what those all meant.
And then I just want everybody to look at it, right? What does it say? Measure the mass of objects and liquid volume using standard units of grams, kilo, right? Like this is really, really specific stuff.
You want me to stop sharing now?
Sure, go ahead. Renee, you wanna build on this? Thank you, Evan.
I was actually teaching right before this happened. I just so happened to stop right as it was being implemented. But I know that, so I never actually had to teach under this. I know that a lot of people that I taught with at the time, though, left and went to go work in the private systems because they just couldn't handle the amount of specificness that was required for them as a teacher. All of a sudden, they weren't used to it. I think that there was some rebound. I don't think that it stayed that way, but I know right about 2001, 2002, a lot of folks that I knew that were teaching went either went to the private school system where this wasn't being implemented, or just changed jobs entirely. So I think that that's kind of interesting and worth noting. The private school systems are not doing this to this extent, but even a lot of the private systems have kind of got on board with the general idea, in that they're trying to get their curriculum in line with this, so that if people move from private to public or public to private, there's still some continuity. So I know that there's a lot of private schools that at the very least will look at their curriculum and try to structure it to kind of match generally to what's going on with this now, though.
It's interesting, the mechanism for that in the private sector comes from two places. One, from accrediting agencies, and in order to participate as, you know, in this regional private school, independent school network, you have to demonstrate some sort of standards. And the other is from college admissions, where they'll say, we need to know what a student knows in order, you know, from your school in order to sort of recognize your degree. Heather, I see your hand, and then to Keisha.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Renee said. She pretty much said everything I was going to say, but I was an assistant teacher at a Jewish day school a few years ago for a couple years. And I just found it crazy how they didn't have any standards. And especially since I worked at like a lower age level, like kindergarten and first grade and stuff like that, where they're learning basic, well, they're supposed to be learning basic ideas of science, social studies, English. They still end up learning, at least I think so, the same things kind of like that the standardization for public schools like lays out for them, yet they don't have standards to follow. So it just kind of gets me wondering like why such strict standards exist, kind of.
I think it's probably a little misleading for, you know, to suggest that there were no standards prior to No Child Left Behind. You know, it wasn't like it really, there were, right? It was just, it wasn't as sort of regulated as what we have now. Teachers were still deciding, like, just like I'm deciding for this course, right? For this course, I'm saying, what do I want you guys to know? How am I going to align my curriculum so that y'all know it? How am I going to test you to determine, you know, like I'm doing that whole process. It's just that I have the autonomy to do it myself, as opposed to having it sort of dictated to me. So, but that's the independence of an independent school, you know, that they don't have the same legal obligation that the teachers among us, y'all have spoken about, in terms of, you know, just being, I don't know, some would describe it as micromanaged, right? Like, it's not that I don't get to decide what I'm going to teach. I'm going to teach standard 2.7 today. To Keisha, and I see Rose, you've got something in the chat, but you also got your hand up. So we'll go to Keisha and then Rose.
Hi, I apologize. I had my other computer on and it was like echoing really bad. I don't know if y'all heard that, but.
Oh yeah, we heard it.
Okay. So I guess I taught social studies and I taught 5th through 8th grade. And at a point in my teaching social studies, it became less about the content of what was being taught, more so about like the skill sets that were being taught. So like the goals of the standards became to teach the, you know, like you're teaching the subject, but what you're really trying to do is focus on the skill sets that come with those subjects. So the social studies, it became a lot more so about focusing on the writing aspect, the reading, the critical thinking aspect that were directly transferable to the English classes. So a lot of my standards became like supplemental to what was being taught in English. So I think it just speaks back to the point of like the nation being in crisis and the standards creating like this structure of, okay, we're teaching the students this in the standard start as early as K, all the way through graduation. So in each grade, in each subject, they're learning the skills that they need to become more competitive. You know, so I don't know. That makes sense.
Good. And I just want to make a quick observation. In a lot of the accountability schemes that grew up out of No Child Left Behind, social studies just wasn't a priority. And so English and math were, and so it makes sense to me to hear Takesha say that they began focusing in social studies on the English content or the writing and reading content, rather than, specific knowledge of social studies. Rose, you're down, so are you good?
Yes.
Okay. Chris?
It's like, I don't know if it's because it's Friday or maybe because like Halloween is tomorrow, but I'm gonna play devil's advocate, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I packed a lot of candy in my lunch, so I'm kind of going off the sugar rush. But I mean, let's say you get all these like specific things you're supposed to do as a teacher. You could argue that because the world is so much more connected, and because it almost seems like there needs to be maybe more specificity to make sure that we're keeping up with like competing nations, and that could have like further implications on like our economy, or if we're prepared to be in the job force. And so maybe more regulation is a good thing.
Well, I mean, I think that is certain. So, if we look at No Child Left Behind, I don't think that there's anything in it that says our goal is to make teachers' lives miserable and to take control of classrooms from teachers so that because the teachers are all failing. I think that the justifications are precisely what Chris is articulating here, that there needs to be some sort of check. And so a lot of times people will phrase this as, pre No Child Left Behind, we were doing a lot of teaching without really knowing what we were delivering. And so they sometimes characterize that era as the era of teaching without testing. And that teaching without testing is irresponsible. You don't know what's going on. There's no telling what is going on in a classroom if you don't evaluate it. And then the other side sort of responds to that. Well, what we've done since 2001 is testing without teaching. It didn't come up so much in the comments from our teachers, in the teachers that you guys have shared, the teachers who have shared with us just now. But often the criticism is from teachers is that what they are being told to do is teach to the test. Right? The test is going to be the assessment of whether or not the standards have been achieved. And so we really don't care whether they know it. We care whether they can perform on the test. And so we are testing without teaching. And so that's also not good, right? So teaching without testing is perhaps irresponsible and problematic, but testing without teaching is potentially also irresponsible. Though in devil's advocate mode, Chris might say, but at least then we know that they can perform on, that they have mastered enough to be able to recognize these particular standards when tested. So a couple of hands pop up there, Abby and then Rose.
I just have really a question that would be like posed towards the teachers in our class that spoke, but like with teachers who do have issues with standardization and stuff, if like what they would have done differently had that standardization not existed, and like if they like the issues that they have with it, they feel like it would have been much different if they had like open reign over how to relay curriculum in their classroom.
Okay. Rose, your hand was up next. So do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can. And I guess it kind of goes to the point that I was going to make from the conversation with you and Chris. But for me, my big issue was that when your school hands you a curriculum map and it has all the standards and it has it done by week and by day, and you're working with your students and you see that your students may be struggling with a particular point, but the school says it's time to move on, you a lot of the times don't have the flexibility to say, well, if given one more day, we could actually get this. They're like, move on, move on, move on.
Yeah.
Or you're like me and you don't move on and you get fussed at later, but you don't mind because it's whatever. But so that was probably my big issue, was that sometimes the people making the curriculum maps aren't people who were educators, so they don't really know how much time it might take to give students information so that they could become masters of the skill. And so I guess for me, I liked a model where we could kind of collaboratively develop the timeline for the skills that needed to be taught, and had a way where we did exit tickets and we checked their mastery as they went, so that way we could make corrections and then continue. I don't know if that really answered your question, but
no, I think that's right on point. Evan and David also popped up after Abby's question.
I was just going to say, really reiterating what Rose said, but I feel like, I guess just thinking back to my experience, there was very little, often very little time to incorporate remediation for skills that you had taken some sort of blanking on the word, you had evaluated somehow, some sort of, test. There's another A word that I was looking for, but
assessment.
And so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to do that, because there was so much strict adherence required for staying with curriculum maps, and to like say that you taught that standard. The other really difficult thing for me was that I taught in Shelby County Schools, so the school district would adopt a curriculum. Some years they would highly suggest you use that curriculum, and they might say you can supplement with these other resources or develop your own. And so some years I would create my own PowerPoints and do all my own assessments and different things like that, or usually with another teacher. And then the last couple of years I was there, they had mandated curriculum that we had to use, and we had to stay on those curriculum maps. The only problem with those was that, well, there were a lot of problems. Basically, my point is, without rambling, which I've already done, is oftentimes it's so multifaceted based on all of those factors. Like the school district, at least for me, because I was in a big school district, as opposed, I know some other people were in different school districts. Shelby County School being so big, they're trying to develop a curriculum to meet the state standards, and also to perform highly on the TCAP, the state standardized test. So you're trying to meet standards that are state mandated. You're also trying to perform well, get the students to perform well on state test. And so, which then also affects your pay and resources potentially that the school might get, or all those different things. So there's just so many factors that play into, not like the standards are just such a big part of that. But there's so many moving parts, and teachers, at least I felt like as a teacher, you kind of had to sacrifice, like Rose was talking about. You either really do what's best for the students sometimes, and sacrifice having to get fussed at later or right then, or you do what's best for the kids. And that is a really hard balance, because obviously it also affects your pay. And so that was always, sometimes I would say, okay, the school district said use this curriculum, I'm going to buy in, I'm going to know everything about it, I'm going to do it. And then the other problem was they would come to take this TCAP and not do very well, because we had done the curriculum that they told us to do, which then also affects my pay, because it affects my teaching score, because the kids didn't perform well. So that's really difficult as part of it just all kind of, I just feel like it's super multifaceted as how all that kind of plays out together.
And then implied in Evan's comments is one of the biggest variable of all, which is the students, right? How the student learns, what the student knows already, all of those, how the student responds to a particular instruction, which the teacher on the ground knows, but the individual who's drawing up the curriculum map probably probably can teach to the average or typical, but not generally. David, did you have anything to add on to the comments from other
The
teachers?
only thing I was going to add is when we're looking at the No Child Left Behind Act and the restructuring when schools don't meet the adequately yearly progress, is that I was able to, I prefer, like when I was teaching in one of the schools that was taken over by the state, all of those requirements, or a lot of those requirements sort of get thrown out the window in that you're allowed to sort of go back and we had a lot more flexibility in what we taught and how we taught it. Like we had our eyes on the, the 8th grade standard, but we were also teaching 3rd grade standards because there were so many gaps in knowledge. And so there was a lot more flexibility in, as far as speed
You're saying once the state took over?
Once the state took over, then we had the flexibility that we needed to meet our students where they were. But when I was working in schools that, were in the same way that Evan was, like, I hated it. But that's just a personal preference, so.
Okay. Okay. So thank you guys again for sharing your perspective. I'm gonna sort of start back with the policy story that No Child Left Behind is very much a major part of, and it affected some of you as teachers, but it probably affected many of you as students as well, having to take the tests and seeing the way in which curriculum was delivered to you as a student. So I'm going to walk through the statute a little bit. So if that's standards-based education reform, how does the federal government, right? So all of that is like on the ground, what happens in schools. The question, for a law school class is like, what is the federal government or what is the law that caused that to happen in classrooms? And so what No Child Left Behind does in response to this perceived crisis that students don't know anything, they say that in order to continue to receive federal funding, the states must adopt standards, align curriculum to those standards, assess or test student mastery, and develop a system of accountability. Okay, and so those are the sort of 4 things that you have to do. Note that they cannot say you must do it this way. They're just saying you have to come up with your standards, align the curriculum, assess whether students are meeting it, and have a system of accountability. Well, what would happen is a state would do that and would submit their program to the Federal Department of Education, and they would either say it's good, or they would say you need to tweak this, this, and this, okay? And then it became state law, right? State law was standards and testing and accountability. And accountability is the sort of main part of the law of this. And I want to focus in on it because it's there in the provisions from No Child Left Behind that I shared. But before I do, I want to note one other part of No Child Left Behind that Professor Black mentioned in his comments, but that really shouldn't be understated. That yes, there was an achievement focus, but there's also an equity focus in No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind is a bipartisan bill and has both the sort of standards-based movement behind it, but also has a really, for the first time, robust equity lens to it. And so what does that look like? So in order to do, for No Child Left Behind to see sort of what it is in practice, let me see if that's that one. Yeah, okay, so what the states have to do is come up with standards and a defined point that says proficiency. The nuts and bolts of the law are that by 2014, every student has to be proficient in everything, right? And so what the law set up was a situation in which we looked at where we were. So the state defines proficiency using its standards and assessments. And then you look at where you are, and then you look at where you need to be, 100% proficiency. And then each year you have to be making adequate yearly progress, AYP. And so this red line is what is going to trace you up to 100% proficiency in 2014. Okay. And so the equity focus here is that AYP is measured not just for each school or each school district, but also for subgroups within that. So each subgroup would have its own chart like this. So there would be like, African-American third graders, or limited English proficient 12th graders, or students with disabilities, or whatever. So there's like, dozens of charts for each school to determine whether they're doing adequate yearly progress. And what the statute required was that every one of those had to be reported out. So there was like a big light shining feature to No Child Left Behind that, we're kind of, well, on the tests as they existed, it was showing the performance, right? And we could have a whole other course on whether or not those tests are, sort of legitimate measures of whether or not someone knows something. But that's another criticism of No Child Left Behind. But at the very least, it showed how students were performing on the tests that were given. And each group had to be making adequate yearly progress. So every racial group, socioeconomic status, students with limited English proficiency, students with disabilities. And so in some ways, this connects to the IDEA, that now not only are schools responsible for providing free and appropriate education to students with disabilities, but they're also responsible to getting them to proficiency under No Child Left Behind. And then there's these escalating accountability options that exist as multiple years of failure build up, right? And so, let me just ask everybody, you can answer in unison. Do you think that that it was realistically possible to get to 100% proficiency on every standard for every group by 2014? Yeah, I'm seeing some heads shaking no, right? Like that's just not realistic. What I think probably happened was they said, that sounds like a great goal. And in 2014, none of us will be in office anymore. And we won't have to worry about the fact that there was not, that we didn't quite get there. So I'm going to go through what did happen. So if you want to get to proficiency and you get to define where proficiency is, and you have to get to 100%, where would you set the proficiency bar? Would you make it really aggressive, or would you make it? What do y'all think? You're thinking strategically, huh?
You'd make it low.
You'd make it low, very, very low. Right, very, very low. Because maybe to the extent we're ever going to get to 100%, the lower we put that proficiency standard, and states can set it wherever they want, the lower we put it, the better chances that we are going to reach it. So what ends up happening is that there's this concept that there's this perverse effect of No Child Left Behind, that instead of elevating standards, states under the threat of losing federal funding started driving their standards to be very, very simplistic and basic so that every student could get there on the assessments. Then, while No Child Left Behind, while the clock is ticking towards 2014 and more schools and school districts and states are becoming non-compliant and are subject to these escalating accountability measures, there's a law gap, right? So one thing that happens is that in the stimulus package in 2009, with regard to the Great Recession, there's this huge pot of money made available. This is called Race to the Top, which is sort of linguistically meant to respond to the problem of race to the bottom. And then closer to 2014, and then even sort of beyond, the Department of Education starts waiving compliance with No Child Left Behind. And I guess we'll start there when we pick back up with this on Tuesday. Okay, so we're going to start with like the demise of No Child Left Behind in the 2010s, and then we'll move from there, and we'll see. And our next topic is school choice. That choice and autonomy, kind of like the flexibility David was referring to, become the way in which to solve this problem at that particular time. Okay, so until then, may the force be with you. Takesha, are you staying on to ask a question? No.